Recording in progress. Okay, perfect. All right, welcome everyone. Today we have a very special guest who's the head of research at YSI and also the head of our Italian chapter, Cesca. She is a medical student and is very passionate about neuroscience and consciousness especially, so that's going to be her talk today. Very fascinating things. I mean, I'm personally just mind blown by consciousness and um, how much we don't know about it and the space for discovery that exists right now in the field. And Cesca will be talking a lot about what we know and even more about what we don't know and what we have yet to discover. So, Cesca, whenever you're ready, take it on.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Amirali, for the opportunity. So the way that I envisioned this session is that I will give you just a brief understanding of what is the current overview of all the consciousness theories, because they're very complex, and also they do require a lot of mathematical background. So I just want to give you a little bit of, we start from history and then we go up to what is going on right now. So the way that I envision it is, first of all, I want to tell you why consciousness, at least for me specifically. What is the current definition that we usually tell when we talk about consciousness? What happened throughout history? What are the latest theories? And then a little bit of a finale, which is main resources to study the theories of consciousness, and also what you can do to understand better all the theories that I will be mentioning. I start with why consciousness. Well, first of all, as Amirali said, I am a medical student, but it's quite common for medical students not to study consciousness. And I was incredibly lucky for to have my professor actually teaching an entire module specifically on consciousness, because he's incredibly obsessed with it. And he basically started with a basic understanding of neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, and then he went on and on the neuroscience of consciousness. And what I realized is that consciousness actually is probably the best topic for me to delve into, because it is connected to a lot of different things. It actually, you can start from the neuroscience part of it, but you can go into philosophy, into math, into history, psychology, into the creative processes, and then obviously into neurology and neurosurgery, which are mainly about the patient and clinical part of consciousness and how it is represented in the hospital. So what is the current definition of consciousness? The state of the art of the definition of consciousness right now is that it is defined as the presence of subjective experience. Let it be the fact that subjective experience is obviously something that is not easy to comprehend, but it is defined on what it is like for a system to be in a given and specific state with a different environment and different context, and the mechanism that determine when and how such experience occurs, and obviously all the objective parts of how much you can measure this experience. And we have 3 levels for this. We have the state, which is basically, are you conscious or are you unconscious? And in these states, we have, obviously, if you're awake, if you're sleeping, if you're under anesthesia, but also if you're in a coma, which is like a specific type of consciousness experience. Then we have the content. So what exactly is experienced? And for contents, we not only mean the experience that you might have when you're awake, but also the experience that you might have while dreaming or while you're asleep. And then you have access and report, which means how you're able to communicate to other people what you felt, what you have experienced, and how it has raised to the level of consciousness. So this is the current definition. And so the first question that I want you guys to answer is, imagine that if I give you a system, it could be an animal, a patient, or an AI, what would convince you specifically that it's conscious? And if Amirali can send you also the link in the group chat, we can see what you guys answer. And you can obviously scan the QR code. Ooh.
Can everyone see the link?
You can,
problems accessing.
oh yeah, I can see like more people that are active. Yeah, it's a multiple choice answer. Nice. Okay, I'll wait a couple more seconds and then I'll keep on going. Okay, so overall, for the people that answered, something like a system that is conscious is more or less a lot of different things. It can be flexibly report and explain the states. It can show complex and integrated internal activity. It has a model of itself, or like sort of knows that it knows. And it can be like depending on the context. And what actually, what you did is basically dividing the theories that we have right now on consciousness. Because when we talk about reporting, we talk about one specific theory of consciousness, which is called the global neuronal workspace theory. Instead, when we talk about integration, we talk about the integrated information theory. When we talk about sensory processing, but also experience processing, we talk about recurrent processing theory. And the self model, like knowing that it knows, it talks about higher order metacognitive theories. And we will go into each one of them after a little bit of history. So why do we need history? Because obviously the idea of consciousness started with, we have a subjective experience. What does it mean to have a subjective experience? Why do we have it? And do we all have the same type of subjective experience? And so in the end, how can we study it from a scientific point of view? So a way that is measurable, that has properties, and that is also scalable and reproducible into different systems. And we start with philosophy, obviously, that dives into then early psychology, the neurology and the clinical revolution of having patients with different type of consciousness according to the various lesions that they experienced. Then we have cognitive psychology, the neural correlates of consciousness, and then the final latest theories. Starting with what is consciousness and what exactly needs explaining, we have three main moments in history for this. We have Descartes, the empiricism versus rationalism, and then we have William James and eventually the cognitive psychology. I divided this according to different eras because I thought that it would exemplify more how people thought in the different periods of times, but also the access that they had to the different types of tools. And this era contributes to defining consciousness as an actual subjective experience. So the fact that you feel something and what it's like to feel something and how does it change according to the experience that you're feeling or experiencing. Then it establishes the core distinction that we are still discussing right now, which is basically the experience versus what it enables you to do. So the fact that experience is correlated to a specific emotion or to a specific consciousness experience, but it is not causally related to it. And then we have the mind versus the matter. So how come if we have a brain, we are also able to have this type of experiences, specifically the conscious experiences and awareness? And we start from the French philosopher, and he said, like, he differentiated the mind from the matter, as in it is the same thing, but at that elevated and higher order and cognitive experience. It then went into empiricism versus rationalism, which means that the first idea was empiricism. So the mind is a stream of experiences, but that have no correlation to the functions that you have in your brain. So you might see something, you might feel something, and you keep on experiencing all of these different things, but they're not related to your basic functions. Instead, rationalism categorized the experiences, and it says that experience is not raw. It's something that you get, then you integrate, then you analyze, then it kind of like shapes your personality, and then you keep on going through your life. And finally, we have William James, which basically united these two theories. And he said the consciousness is indeed a stream of experiences that keep repeating and recurring. But you also have a great connection with all of the different functions, such as attention, memory, recollection, all the different skills that you develop. And this leads us to the clinical revolution that we have in neurology, beginning of the 20th century, which says that basically consciousness is not a single faculty and something that basically is independent, but it actually depends on networks and integration. And now we see what this means. This era contributes to understanding the fact that consciousness can be very different according to the type of experience that you have, but also the type of quote-unquote brain that you have. Because first of all, consciousness can be different if you had a lesion in your brain. And so neurologists want to understand why that is so. And so where is consciousness located, if it's located somewhere? Spoiler, it's not located anywhere, but obviously they thought that the lesion would eventually localize the consciousness itself. And then the other question was, what actually defines consciousness in patients that are not able to report or communicate the effective awareness of the experiences that they have lived? And all of this leads us to the fact that even if you're processing an emotion or an experience, doesn't mean that you're actually able to report it. And it also means that we all can have different type of experiences and different type of conscious awareness of those same experiences. And so what the neurologists did is that they identified 3 main lesions in the brain and understood that consciousness behaves differently according to the different lesions. Starting with blindsight. When patients have blindsight, it means that basically they had vision before in their life, then they suddenly lost it, but somehow they are still able to retrieve the feeling of understanding where things are in the environment. Obviously, this is because of a map that our brain built around the space, but they're also somehow able to feel things that are approaching through proprioceptive, let's say proprioceptive skills. But this means that you can have a behavior that feels like you're actually seeing things without experience, because these people were able to see without having the vision. And this already makes you feel like, okay, so consciousness is something quite different than what we used to think. Then we have neglect, which is really, really important, because what happens is that some patients have lesions at the level of the visual cortex. And so they do see, but they are not able to integrate the experience and the things that they're actually seeing. So you might see patients that have like a plate full of food, but they start eating only half of the plate because they see the other half, but they're not able to understand that they actually have it in front of them. And so you have an inked sensory input because you're able to see everything, but you don't feel the experience. And then you have the split brain. The split brain is actually like something a little bit peculiar, but basically what happens is that some people are born without the corpus callosum, which is basically this anatomical structure between the 2 hemispheres of the brain that connects a lot of different structures, and also like it integrates a lot of back and forward information between the 2 hemispheres. And these people basically experience a partial autonomy of conscious contents, which means they have 2 consciousness. They respond differently according to the type of input that they receive. They also have seen, some neurologists, that people that end up having the corpus callosum cut after like 25 or 30 years of age, they do not experience this type of double consciousness because the consciousness in both hemispheres have been already mirrored, so they don't go and evolve into different consciousness. And now we have cognitive psychology, because neurology showed us at the beginning of the 20th century that we have dissociation through different type of lesions in the brain, which is incredibly interesting, but doesn't explain consciousness in healthy people. So the question that we have right now is, how can we make consciousness appear or disappear in healthy people on demand, and specifically in a lab or like a controlled environment? And what this era contributes is making consciousness a variable, something that can be manipulated and that can be understood through specific type of properties. And so how consciousness can be variable, even if the stimulus is the same for different type of people. So what they did is that obviously compared a lot of different trials, but also a lot of the key paradigms that I'm going to show you are things that you either have seen already in your life because they're quite common, or they're things that are now being used as basic tests and they are recognized as protocols in cognitive psychology. And they are designed to separate the stimulus, so what is actually hits your senses. So if you've heard something, if you've seen something, if you've touched something, then how do you process it? Like, how do you integrate information? And finally, we divide into the experience. So what did you feel consciously, and what arises at the level of the consciousness? And you might have seen some of these things, but basically, these are all key paradigms that are used in cognitive psychology. The first one is called masking. And basically what it does is that it explains how the brain processes things without you being actually aware. Because what it does is that the experimenter shows you a lot of different images that you can see here. And then suddenly, in the middle of some of these images, he puts a word, like a random one. And you might think, okay, like I have not seen it. I've seen it for like a couple of seconds or even less. So I'm not able to actually be conscious that I've seen that word. But actually, it has been shown that people start talking or like identifying words that are similar to the one that they have seen, even though they're not consciously aware about it. And this is called masking. Then we have attentional blink, which is an experiment that shows that conscious awareness has a speed limit, because if I keep showing you words after words that all have like the same significance, you are not able to remember or integrate the information that you see from all these different words. Like you might remember the first word, then the one after 5 seconds, then the one after another 5 seconds, and so on. And that explains that consciousness has a speed limit. Then we have binocular rivalry, which I think is really, really cool. This is an image that's quite famous. And what happens is that according to how you're actively selecting in your brain the type of experience, you might see 2 things. You might see the cup, or you might see 2 people. And that explains how the experience can be actively selected. And then you have change blindness. Change blindness, again, explains that awareness is selective, but in a different way. Because if I were to do the experiment with you, I will show you an image, and then I will show you the same image, but with some small details changed. And since when you're completely conscious of the scene, you just get the overall context of what is happening, you will not even notice the details that have been changed. This is why, like, if you were like looking at a magazine or those things for kids, you'll see identify what are the things that have changed from one image to the other. You actually have to be selectively attentive of the details, otherwise you wouldn't be able to notice them. And this takes us to NCC, which are the neural correlates of consciousness. What does it mean? In the beginning of the 20th century, we started getting more and more tech, specifically more neurotech tools, such as functional MRI and electroencephalography studies, which are basically putting the electrodes around in places in the brain, and it helps you in studying the brain waves. Since we have all of these tools, what happens is that this field becomes incredibly data rich. And since you have all of this data, you also need people that start understanding how this data behaves and why does it behave in a specific type of way, which means a lot of statistical analysis and EEG analysis. And so the neural correlates are basically specific parts of the brain where they have noticed that the brain waves change after a specific type of experience. And this is incredibly helpful, specifically in like the different state of consciousness. So to understand if a person is awake, if it's sleeping, if it's under anesthesia. And also if people that are in coma are not actually fully in coma, but they're able to sort of communicate to the external world, but they don't have the ability to move their arms, limbs, or like to move their eyes. So the EEG has been actually an incredibly revolutionary system. And obviously it has also opened the field of sleep, because from brainwaves you also understood that there is REM sleep, how dream behaves, and a lot of different type of sleep disturbances and pathologies. But apart from that, there's obviously a huge disagreement, because when you see the change in brainwave is obviously like correlated to something happening, so it happens afterwards. So it's not causal. And what it means is also that the more you perturbate the environment where you're doing your experiments, the less you're able to actually understand what are the measures that are objective, quote unquote. And this takes us to the last part, which is right now. What has happened from 2000 to 2026? We are trying right now to stop theory accumulation. And what does it mean? It means that anyone in their labs have been trying to create a different type of computational models, different type of math models, trying to understand and identify what consciousness is and how it can be replicated. But now we have way too many theories. So what we want to do instead is start large collaborations, comparing all the different theories and where they overlap so that we can create a concrete protocol to understand what consciousness is. And so we have also reduced subjective experiences, which are the reports, so asking people what does it feel like to do something. And instead, we try to isolate experience-related activities. There's another question that I want to ask you. So in a masking experiment, which is the experiment that I told you about, so having all the different images, and at one point you get a random word, and then you get all other images. If the behavior changes, so you start saying words that are associated to what you, like to the word that was hidden in the images, but the subject reports nothing, do you think there was actually experience? And okay, nice. Obviously, like this is something that is very difficult to explain because actually it is currently being studied. But personally speaking, I always thought there is a sort of experience, but that is different from being consciously aware that experience has happened. So maybe it is not a high cognitive order, but it's like a very low level of cognitive order. Oh, nice. A lot of people think that it's yes. Okay. Okay. Now, the best part, the latest theories in consciousness. So when we talked about before on report, which is basically communicating what you have experienced, we are talking actually about access and availability of information because you're able to retrieve that specific information from an experience that you had. And this is related to one specific theory, which is called the global neuronal workspace theory. What does it mean? That it is the consciousness in this theory is defined as accessible. So when you have a representation that it has become globally available to all the cognitive systems, so reporting, memory, planning, and decisions, then you actually have consciousness. And to give an example, like if you have your own desk and you have a lot of different tools, those tools are all of these things. So your values, your past, your present, future, focusing, everything that you've ever lived, you have on this desk. And that is what is available to you. And that is what is conscious for this specific theory. What does it mean is that everything that doesn't become available to the global workspace of the brain, then it doesn't become conscious. So you might have it, but you're not able to retrieve it. The second one is incredibly famous because it explains how consciousness is in an intrinsic structure and how it integrates at the level of the different systems that we have. The integrated information theory was developed actually by two Italian scientists, Marcello Massimini and Giulio Tononi, who I had actually the pleasure to meet. And what they say is that consciousness is an intrinsic property of the system organization, which means that you have all these different type of systems that are working for something, like the auditory system, the visual system, the proprioceptive system, you have the part of memory and stuff like that. But unless they are able to be integrated in a bigger structure, like let's say a conceptual structure, if they don't do that, then they are not able to arrive at the level of the consciousness, which means that the more the systems are isolated, the less you're able to consciously retrieve that information and consciously use that skill. Which is why sometimes you're told, you know, when you're studying something, always try to attach the learning to something that you already know, because that makes it integrated to something that already exists in your brain. And so it's way easier to actually retrieve that information. And so what they did is that they studied the brain with the functional MRIs. And you can see that what happens is that you get an experience. That experience is obviously, like, for example, hearing a word or seeing something. It gets integrated into a conceptual structure of like comparing things from the past, present, and future. And then it gets activated in various points of your brain at the level of the physical substrate. And they also understood like where is the high firing, because obviously like when you have seen something, then is the visual cortex. If you have heard something, is the auditory cortex. But the main important thing is that you not only activate one single structure, but you activate a lot of different systems. And by doing that, you have the integrated information. Oh, sorry. Okay. I don't know why this is so difficult. It doesn't upload. This is probably the most complicated one, but it sort of integrates with the first one that I talked about. And basically it explains consciousness as a local sensory dynamics. What happens is basically that whenever you say that you can understand things that have happened only because they're in the past, that is the theory that sort of explains it. Because it says that consciousness arises only once you have fully integrated all the experiences and you're thinking about them in a feedback manner, and then you're able to like plan it in a feed-forward manner. I'm not going to explain in depth, but you can see that in this image, it is divided into 4 quadrants, and you have the part where you're unconscious and inattentive, which is basically all the superficial stimuli that you get from the external world, but that you don't need to understand, or like you don't need to take into consideration. Then you have the second step where you're attentive, but you're still unconscious. Like, for example, when you're listening today to a webinar, you are attentive to what has been said, but the information is not yet consciously present in your brain. Then you have the third stage, which is conscious but inattentive, which is basically you're currently integrating all the different information that you had, both from the first part and the second part, but it is mostly phenomena, so things happening in the outside but are not strictly correlated to you, or they don't need your attention right now. And then you have access conscious, which is the attentive and conscious part, which is related to the global workspace. So you have integrated all the different experiences. You're able to be fully attentive and fully conscious of everything that you've been doing or you have lived. And you're now able to not only retrieve it, but also plan in the future. And by planning in the future, it needs to be consciously aware of different types of things that might happen, different events. And this is the highest level of consciousness that you can have in this specific theory. And then we have the last one, which is consciousness as self-knowledge. This is a little bit of a weird one, because it basically says that as long as you're aware that you're aware, then you're conscious. And to do that, it means that after you have the first order representations, which are basically all the first stimuli that you get in, which is like visually, auditory, then you start analyzing them, integrating them to different order of representations, which are higher and higher, means they're integrated also with different things. And when you're only taking the things that are factual, so what happened, then you get a phenomenal consciousness. So being aware of what has happened and being able also to report it to other people and communicate it. Instead, if you also add the autobiographical knowledge, which is like when you have personally lived something and how that has shaped you, then you also get the working memory and the phenomenal self-awareness. So being able to be aware that you are aware, which is like a higher order representation of being that state. And it also means that you're perfectly able to report and communicate all the things that you have lived and the different experiences. And last but not least, there are 2 theories that are actually not fully developed, but they're quite interesting. One is predictive processing, and one is the attention schema theory. The predictive processing mainly talks about the feed-forward understanding of our consciousness. So the fact that after you've integrated all the different experiences, you're able to predict what is going to happen next through a comprehension of environmental maps, of space and time, of your life, it's basically understanding the fact that you are a human being in a life that is finite, and that you're able to understand what is going to happen in the future. And you also have the ability to statistically predict if your prediction was correct or not, which is basically what is happening now. Like you have a prediction and the predictions can be as small as I have seen something and I think something else is happening, which is almost unconscious because it's mostly almost a reflex. And it can also go to higher order predictive predictions, which are basically actually mapping out your entire life. And you can do a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. The top-down is choosing something and then understanding how that will eventually happen. And then the prediction error instead is understanding how that will not work, and that is bottom-up. So from the latest things that you have understood, you go from the bottom up to the first prediction that you made. And then you have the attention schema theory, which is interesting. It's like a more defined version of the self-knowledge one, because basically, in simple terms, is you have a human being that is looking at an image, for example, an apple. The human being understands that he is a human being looking at an apple. And that is the attention schema theory, meaning that you're able to be in third person, understanding that you are an entity that can do things and that is able to communicate and report it to other people as well. And here's the last question, which is, which description resonates the most with you right now that I've told you all the different theories? And so we have the consciousness, which is the global access, the global workspace theory. We have consciousness as integration, so you have a lot of different experiences and you integrate it from the ground up. And then you have consciousness with recurrent perception, and then self-knowledge. Let's see what you guys think. I like the self-knowledge. Yeah, I agree actually that multiple are needed because overall, all of these theories are very independent between each other, apart from like a couple of overlapping, but we do need like a specific protocol that works for every type of perspective. Okay, nice. Let's say that multiple are definitely needed. Okay, then I'll go into the last part, which is, now you know what are all the different theories at the moment in the consciousness realm. So what I would do if I were you to start is, first of all, getting a generic overview of the theories which you have done today, and then doing neuroanatomy and neurophysiology using a specific book, which is it's called Principles of Neuroscience, which is incredibly important. Then what I would do is read extensively, subscribe to all the neuroscience journals, and constantly see and look if there are any type of new consciousness papers. And it's best to choose at least like one theory before deep diving into every single one of them, because it's a lot. And personally, I would start from the information integrated theory. First of all, because it also has like a little bit of mathematical models in it, and it gives you a generic understanding also of computational neuroscience, which is a topic that is becoming more and more relevant in consciousness. And also because it's probably the most extensive one, so it explains a lot also of the other theories. Then definitely methods and mapping. So after you understood at least one theory, understand the mechanism families. So what I've told you today, but a little bit more in depth, and how they overlap between each other. So you start with one, and then you go with all the rest of the theories. And then I would recommend choosing a depth track, because consciousness is becoming extensively relevant, not only in neuroscience, but also in neurotech. So there is a lot of requirement for different type of roles, even in data analysis. And I would recommend definitely cognitive neuroscience, because it helps you also in understanding how to analyze, for example, EEG data and different type of things. The integration route, which is basically choosing two theories and trying to understand how they overlap between each other, which is both a work of reading, but also of applying. And then computational and psychiatry. So understanding how you can make your own brain models on your computer and how they work and how it will eventually be able to create an actual consciousness. And I would recommend you one specific paper, which I think is incredibly good because it talks about the theories that I talked about today. And it came out April last year, and it's incredibly good. And it's called the Adversarial Testing of Global Neural Workspace and the ITT Theories of Consciousness. And what they do is that they have done an actual experimental trial. So you can also understand what are the tests that we are using right now in the consciousness realm. There you go. Thank you so much, everyone.
Amazing presentation, Cesca. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in or type them in the chat. I see we have
Thank you.
questions already.
Or
one.
Well, Mariam already answered this, but there is obviously a relationship between consciousness and subconscious. The difference is that wait, sorry, I got it. The difference is that when something is subconscious, usually you're not aware of it. So the awareness is what makes you feel like something is conscious, like that is the brief description. But you can have a lot of the things that are subconsciously stored in your mind that have not yet reached consciousness, and that will require eventually like some time or more experience. What defines awareness is when you're able to actually report what you're feeling or all the experiences that you've lived. And this is also connected with the consciousness and subconsciousness. But I think that subconscious and consciousness are actually definitions that we mostly use in psychiatry, according to like the different theories. I'm super happy that was enriching and informative. Yes, binocular observability is actually used to study between left and right hemisphere, but mostly in people that have the split brain. So trying to understand if you have your, let's say, both hemisphere divided, and also if you're seeing something different from one eye to the other, because people that have the split brain see something different in the left and in the right eye, and they use those images to do that. Which model using consciousness? I don't know if there's one that is best to study, but I would say that if you're studying animal consciousness, you need to be aware of the constraints, which means that you have a lot of perturbation when you're doing that in an environment, because obviously you're taking the animal outside of its normal environment and you're putting it to do things that they wouldn't normally do. So you have a lot of constraints. And what you're trying to do right now, researcher, is to implant EEG into animals without them being aware of that. So you can also study them in their normal habitat. I would recommend computational simply because it's the one that is mostly used right now, and also because it is the one most requested in the labs at the moment. And also because it's the most accessible. Like you can make a model of the cerebellum in your computer literally like tonight. It's called, I can also send you this. I'm not mistaken, it's called Deep Brain, but I can send you more info on the group chat. Thus, knowing you are conscious, like you have something inside you, makes you have a broad spectrum of thoughts and awareness. I wouldn't say that it makes you more like have a broad spectrum of thoughts and awareness, but I would say that the more conscious and aware you are, the better you're also able to see the pattern across the different thoughts and different things that you do. But it also depends on what you think, like what you define as thoughts, because you can have a broad spectrum of being consciously aware of the things that you do, but you can also not being able to think through a lot of different things. Like they're two separate things, in my opinion. But the fact that you're conscious, like you can become more conscious from a psychiatric point of view. I don't think you can become more conscious from a neurological point of view, unless, no, I don't think so. Like I think they're two different things. And I think that being aware of your own experiences makes you conscious in the neuroscience realm. If I change the series convention. The fact of artificial intelligence, a really great question. The point is, that is why we need to define what consciousness is, because a lot of people are saying that if we have robots that are able to be conscious and that have volition, they have goals, and they have a lot of different things that make us human, then they can be identified as conscious. The problem is that it's like a feedback loop, like that we created their consciousness, so we also perturbated their own environment. I think it will stay an advanced machine up until we get to AGI and to a consciousness that is related to their own like volition and sense of goal. Are there stages of consciousness? Yeah, there are, but the stages of consciousness are actually related to mostly to sleep. And the stages of consciousness are also related to the coma scale. So how a person is effectively aware of their state. And I can show it to you actually, because I think it's really interesting. There are seven stages, of consciousness. I cannot find the image that I want. I will send it later in the group chat. But the idea is that you can divide consciousness in the terms of stages into two different things. The stages that you have like in sleep and coma patients. So actually people that are able to say, I understand where I am in space and time. And then you have another part of consciousness, which is instead what Amruta was saying before. So the fact that you're aware of your own thoughts, goals, volition, and different type of things. But the coma scale is mainly between this patient is not responsive to this patient enables to fully communicate where he is. And the other one is someone that is totally unconscious of being a human being with an identity, goals, etc., to someone that is trying to self-actualize themselves in their life. I hope I was exhaustive with your answers. Thank you so much, guys. Actually, they are super interesting questions.
All right, thank you so much. If there are no other questions, well, we can conclude the session, and Cesca can send some things in the group chat later to address some questions and also like the stages of consciousness. But yeah, thank you so much for attending this session, everyone. Thank you so much for Cesca for presenting about consciousness, such a mind-blowing topic. And we'll see you again tomorrow. Take care.
Yeah. Feel free to text me, obviously. Bye, everyone.